Our final speaker, Wendy Craig, changing hats from neuroscientist to peer relations researcher, right? Are you there, Wendy?
Trying to, yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah, I'm here.
I don't know if Fred introduced you formally before. Wendy's a professor and head of psychology at Queen's University in Canada, has done a lot of early work on observations too. Her early study with Deborah Pepler is often to show that 80% of the kids were standing around watching kids get victimized. That research is still highly cited, and work on gender differences in the experiences of bullying. Um, so today I think you're going to talk a little bit about race and culture and context and these multiple roles, correct?
Yeah, I'm going to start a bit with the fluidity and then end on race and culture. Yeah.
All right, great. You're on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's great to be here and present. I guess I'm going to start at, I would like to thank the other two speakers, not only for their great work that laid the foundations, but for also setting me up really nicely. But one of the things that I talk about is that bullying is a relationship problem, and it's the most destructive relationship we can imagine. It's about a relationship that occurs between the child who's bullying and the child who's being victimized, but it's also about the larger relationships that unfold in the group dynamics surrounding that bullying and the larger peer group, as well as larger contextual characteristics that support those group dynamics. And so I'm going to briefly touch on each of these. And I guess I want to say my work is really driven by our early observational work, where we noticed that peers were present in 85% of the episodes of bullying that we observed, that the more peers that were present, the longer the episodes were, the more severe the episodes were in terms of the aggression in the episodes, and with each additional peer there was an added increase of that aggression. The other thing is that we found that when we observed them, the primary role that peers were doing was that they were actively supporting the child who was being bullied. They were not supporting the child who was being victimized. We also found that they could be successful at intervening. In about 57% of the episodes, the bullying stopped within 10 seconds after the peer intervened. And when they intervened, it was about half-time, it was pro-social, and about half-time, it was anti-social. So it really reinforces that notion that this is a relationship problem at the group level as well. And so we went on to, based on Christina's work, to look at peer roles in a couple of examples, about 500 children in elementary school and about 600 children in high schools. And we didn't replicate her exact roles that were found, but we were fairly close. So we actually found two types of pro-social roles, of defending roles. One was pro-social, one was anti-social. We found the bullying role. We found the secondary aggression, so that would be students who joined in on the aggression, and that outsider behavior. And we found them in both age cohorts. So they seem to be present from grade 3 all the way through to grade 12. What I want to show you here is a bit related to what Karen was talking about, is the fluidity, that there was a correlation among that. So, for example, I've highlighted them in bold here. In the younger cohort, there was more correlations among the roles. So pro-social defending was related to anti-social defending. Anti-social defending was related to bullying, as well as secondary aggressing, so in the ways that we would expect. But by high school, there was fewer significant correlations among the roles, so that they were becoming more distinct. Here's a slide that just shows the prevalence of those roles when we put them into specific roles with the cutoffs. And what you can see here is the solid lines are elementary school, blue males, pink females, and the striped lines are our high school examples. And so two things that I want you to note from this slide. First of all, in terms of pro-social defending, more girls than boys do it, and that increases with age. Anti-social defending, more boys do it than girls, and there seems to be a decrease for boys in particular with age. Secondary aggression, that role decreases with age, and outsiders, interestingly, decrease with age for both boys and girls. In terms of understanding the dynamics, we also looked at the relationship among those people who were victimized, and I think what this graph shows is basically that most of the time in bullying, they know there's some type of a relationship that exists, which also speaks about the dynamics and how they unfold. So, in 20% for boys, they were part of the group, and, another 18% they were a friend. So 38% of the episodes, there's a known relationship. And most of the time, if we look at know a little, in my group, or friend, for both boys and girls, they know who's perpetrating the bullying. It's not a surprise or a one-off event, as been stated. So that also adds to the complexity. We also looked at it, and based on Christina's work, developed a peer rule for the electronic context, because we wondered, what is the role of peers in the electronic context? And we found that the defender role, the aggressor role, and the secondary role, and the child who's victimized. We've done this primarily with high school students. This particular example is about 900 of them in grades 9 to 12. And again, what you see here is the roles correlate. So there doesn't seem to be that there is this fluidity among the roles, but the interesting piece is, well, both online and offline, they're taking similar kinds of roles. When we look at them in terms of just who belongs in what role based on cutoffs, you can see the most common role is defender in this slide, and it's most likely to be females. When you look at the correlates of these electronic roles, they're almost exactly as we see them in the offline roles, that people who defend tend to report higher scores in perspective-taking, self-efficacy, and pro-social behavior. If you're a secondary electronic, it's more related to social aggression. And interestingly, on and offline, defending was highly correlated. It was at about a 0.58 correlation. So there seems to be some consistency across context. And this just sort of shows you in a regression that relationship in particular in a regression. So I guess I wanted to say this to have a sense of that peers take these roles, but the roles shift, and there seems to be more stability in the roles with age, and that the roles that to whom they're aggressing, it's a known person. And here's another study that we had with younger children showing that most of the cyberbullying, like most of the offline bullying, is really done by people that they know. It's denoted by the green lines who are friends, bars, or the blue who are other students. So it's less, but more likely in the case of electronic to be strangers or someone they don't know than in the offline role. But there is this sense of that there's relationships among the groups and among the children involved. We're particularly interested in online, in intervening, and it sort of feeds off of the work that Christina's talking about. And here's when we started to break down. We did two things. We just tried to break it down by age, and you can see that, this is a second study with about 8,000 children across the country, that more kids are reporting online intervening than they are offline intervening. And that, again, there seems to be that gender effect. We also were interested in the cost, so in understanding why kids don't intervene. So we looked at the chronicity of intervening, so how frequently do you intervene, as well as those kids. We compared the bystanders who say they don't intervene, so that these are bystanders who are not victimized, not bullying, but they don't intervene, versus bystanders who say they intervene and they also don't bully or they aren't victimized. And we found an interesting effect here, that for certain kinds of problems, like internalizing problems, our interveners, particularly the younger grades, were reporting more frequent internalizing problems, and those internalizing problems were further increased by the chronicity in which you intervene. So in other words, intervening had some cost to the children who were doing it. We found a similar kind of pattern with respect to having academic problems, and a similar kind of problem with respect to having psychosomatic problems, but no effect with externalizing problems. So So I think that's just that this is a group process, and the group processes have cost not only to the child who's being victimized, but also to the children who are intervening potentially. So I wanted to give that piece before I went on to talk about the broader context. And I guess the messages that I want you to take from this piece is that they take very different kinds of roles. The roles change with development, and there are some costs associated with those roles. In thinking about the makeup of the peer group and group processes, we've also looked at how race and immigration status might represent or influence experiences of peer victimization. And we've taken an approach of looking at the theory of in-group biases, where we're looking at sort of the composition of schools, the composition of classes, and the composition of communities to look at the in-group and the out-group processes that might result as a function of group affiliation. And so we've done this in a couple of different studies, and I'm going to just walk you through it. In one study, it's a longitudinal study done with about 3,684 students in grades 6 to 10. And the example, I put that up on purpose to reflect Canadian. These are Canadian data. I'm going to talk about two studies, and both of these studies represent the normative distribution of the demographics in Canada with respect to race. So it will be different for the states. So in this first study I'm going to talk about, there are about 3,684 students, and in the second study I'm going to talk about, there are about 12,000 students, and it's a nationally represented sample. So in the first study, what we did was we looked at, through a HLM analysis, we looked at how do individual factors contribute to racial victimization and other forms of victimization, and how, and also how did school factors contribute to that. And I guess the quick summary of that work was that really racial bullying and victimization were better predicted by individual level factors in this first study, such as race, and there were certain backgrounds that were at a heightened risk for being victimized in both types. And what we basically found was that ethnic minorities experienced more racial victimization as well as the other types of victimization. And what we found was that the largest minority groups were at the highest risk within a school. So we also found school effects, so that it was the largest minority group that was at the highest risk for being victimized of these types. We also found that students at an individual level, immigrant students, were at a higher risk, and they were at a particularly high risk for physical bullying. So they were being bullied, but they were also at a risk for different types of victimization, not so much racial, but those social victimization and physical victimization as well. We also, in our longitudinal analysis, we found that there seems to be sort of this transactional or relationship that racial bullying likely precedes racial victimization 1 year later. That is, when we ran our models both ways, we only found significance going in that one direction, but we can't talk about causality. So individual factors mattered more. In our second study, we looked at a variety of different things. So this is our cross-Canadian study. And we looked at neighborhood factors. So through GIS mapping, we were able to code things within, so we had the postal code of each of the children in the study, and we looked at within 1 kilometer of their home, how many recreational centers were there, but how many different types of religious affiliations or cultural affiliations were there in the neighborhood. So in this one, we were really looking at community effects, school effects, and individual effects. And I wanted to point out what we found here was particularly interesting. We replicated what we found before in the sense that individual factors mattered much more than those other two levels, the school and the community factor.
But we did find some interesting effects at the school level. And I think these will speak to targets potentially of intervention. What we found is that where there were schools that had a greater racial diversity of the teachers, they had less racial victimization and bullying. It accounted for some of that behavior. And so in a sense, and not only that the schools that had the racial diversity, that effect was further enhanced because it was perceived that they had greater school support. So when there was high diversity, there was more school support, and it was related to decreases in racial bullying. So I think that this is really an important kind of issue, because I think going back to the comment about that bullying is really about relationships. What we're trying to show here is it's about relationships not only among the children themselves, but the relationships among the adults and what they can potentially monitor in terms of respect and tolerance and for diversity. And so the students were in schools, they would lose less racial bullying and aggression when they felt supported and cared for by their teachers. So the quality of the relationship, and particularly when the school was one that had a diverse composition, mattered. So having high diversity increased this relationship. And so it indicated that belonging to an in-group that includes the teacher may decrease the need to bully others. So I think there's this notion about, we also found that there were some other findings about the diversity in the community with respect to religious buildings, with respect to cultural organizations that resided within the community mattered, and it was related to reduced bullying and racial bullying in particular, and racial victimization. So diversity in communities, diversity in schools among the adults themselves seems to act in a positive way, although those two effects are much smaller than the actual effects of your individual race. The other thing that came apparent in these analyses is that when we considered these larger community effects, that it
Wendy,
wasn't about...
I'm going to have to interrupt you and ask you to summarize in 30 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to summarize, because this last effect that I just wanted to mention was that it was about being a minority in a community. You were more likely to be racially victimized than being a majority. So it wasn't about the individual background that you brought to the situation, but it was about the relative composition of the neighborhood that increased your vulnerability. So that being white in a minority in a neighborhood, you would be victimized. If you were white and a majority in a neighborhood, you would be less likely to be victimized. So the point is, think about the group processes. The roles are dynamic and depend on the context. Context matters. And adult relationships also matter, and the quality of those relationships matter. Thank you.